I found the secret by trying to rename a folder. It was a Saturday that smelled like stale cereal and the cord-warm scent of laptops. My mother was at the back of the apartment in the darkroom. She refuses to call a closet, coaxing a roll of film to remember light. My father had burrowed under the sink to fix a pipe that had decided it no longer respected gravity. I was at my desk, ankle bouncing to a playlist I would deny listening to if you asked, cleaning up our family server so I could clear space for a stupid video project about the history of our town's train station. I wanted to call the project Steam Dream, but my friend Eva told me that sounded like an app for ironing clothes, so we went with Platformed. I opened the home server's web panel Hestia, because Dad named it during his Greek myth phase, and clicked through the nested boxes where our entire shared life lives. Photos, taxes, homework, the recipe folder with Mom's breadcrumbed mac and cheese, the archive where my father keeps his lovingly labeled collection of mystery PDFs like a dragon hoard of forms. There was a folder I'd never noticed before, _orchard. The underscore made it look shy. Inside, subfolders labeled with dates, except the dates were wrong. October 12, 1998, held pictures of me at 7, mud-smeared and grinning under a birthday banner with a cartoon train. April 25, 2010, contained a scan of my parents' marriage certificate, which they have always said was 2003. "Hey, Dad," I yelled toward the kitchen. "Is the year of your wedding open to interpretation?" He banged something into compliance. "We celebrated late," he called back. To be clear, I am not a hacker. I'm not the kid who wears a hoodie in July and speaks in shell commands. I know more about shutter speeds than server logs. But I was raised by a photographer who can extract an EXIF hash from a SI and a man who speaks in backups like they are a form of prayer. It is difficult to grow up in that tea of competence and not absorb at least one steeped leaf. I clicked a photo. It opened to a couple I knew in the kind of way you know people you've watched your whole life. Mom had shorter hair than I've ever seen on her and a tan line in the shape of an old watch. Dad had a different face. Not a different face like surgery. A different face like he was using more of it. They stood by a wall painted with giant lemons and the word amphitryones in a hand that had never believed in rulers. They were laughing. I checked the metadata the way Mom taught me, even though the metadata in our family is more sacred than the photo. The date said 1999, and the camera was a Nikon F3, a film camera, of course. What felt wrong was the GPS. It hovered me over a street in a city my parents have only ever mentioned to say, "We never did get there. Puebla, Mexico." I clicked back, opening more files as if by touching enough pixels I'd put them back into the sequence I thought I understood. In one, a woman with a scarf I would steal if it still existed sat next to my mother on a curb, both of them eating mango, hands sticky, laughing with their heads thrown back. In the corner, a child stared directly at the camera with the terrifying solemnity only 5-year-olds and most cats possess. In another, Dad, my father, the man who currently owned the wrench under our sink, stood next to a corrugated metal door painted with a number that looked like a date. For 13ths. His hand was on the shoulder of a man with a tattoo of a bird whose wing feathers were tiny numbers. The thing about a digital trail is you never set out to make one. Footprints are made of water and then pretending they never were there. You take a picture to remember a face, and a satellite writes down where your feet were. You scan a document and the scanner stamps it with the serial number of its grumpy little heart. You export a file and the program leaves a note under the floorboards like a lighthouse keeper penciling his height on the doorframe. Export preset, author initials, ICC profile, the weather if it was feeling poetic that day. I noticed the ICC profile, Adobe RGB, Orchard, ICC, and the little comment in the EXIF I almost missed, Lark Rule, 314. I touched 314 with my mouse as if it would react, then laughed at myself. Bye. Lark? Birds? My mother calls everyone bird. "Come here, little bird," she says to toddlers and toothaches. I opened the root folder again and saw it, a zip file with a name like an oath. Lark_Haskap_1997. Zip. It was locked, of course. I tried the futility password every child tries. My birthday. Then the other one, my name. The archive did not even have the decency to say no. It just waited, humming in zeros, like a person who has decided to refrain from telling you what you already know. I closed the laptop and went to the kitchen. My father was on his back with his head inside dark plumbing, the kind of human still life you paint if you want to say dignity without saying dignity. He slid out, wrench clenched between his teeth. "Do you know what a hascap is?" I asked. He blinked at me, then spit out the wrench. "A berry," he said. "Tastes like a decision." "Why?" "I think there's a folder on Hestia that wants me to think it's about fruit." His face did a thing I've seen maybe 3 times, like a curtain moved by a draft everyone else missed. Then he smiled with his calmest smile, which I have since learned is the one he uses on enemy weather. "Myra's in the darkroom," he said, which was his way of suggesting that it was unwise to open doors without both of them in the room. I did not open the door. I went back to my desk and pretended to be a child who has never met a lock. I cleaned my downloads folder of 6 identical homework files labeled Final Train Station. Docs. I googled hascap and learned that it is also called honeysuckle and that someone once wrote a blog post about making jam that ended with a divorce. I stared at the archive waiting. Then the Ciroan job on Hestia kicked on and reminded me to stop pretending I fall outside time. I waited until dinner, which we ate late because the pipe was angrier than most. My mother smelled like stop bath and lemons. My father set plates on the table like a man setting the first 4 stones of a foundation. We sat, we blessed the food in our own untidy ways, and then I carried my curiosity to the table like a guest who has not yet decided whether to behave. "What is Lark Rule 314? I asked. Mom didn't look at Dad. Dad didn't look at Mom. They looked at me. "Where did you see that?" she asked, voice so neutral it qualified as a timesheet. "In the metadata of a photo," I said. "In _orchard. Also, your wedding is very early compared to when I thought I existed." Mom put down her fork very carefully. "You were born right when you were born," she said. "No earlier, no later." I wanted to do the teenage thing where I say I don't care. I wanted to perform indifference so convincingly HBO would hire me. Instead, I said, "I found a password archive. I didn't break anything. I just asked an archive a question and it didn't answer." Dad cleared his throat, a sound like a chair that has held a lot of fathers. "Lark was my name for your mother," he said. "You are allergic to nicknames," I said. "I am," he agreed. "Except when I'm not." "So what's the rule?" Mom sighed and pushed her plate back softly. 3 words we promised each other we would never forget," she said. "One truth, one lie, one thing we thought we'd always be too afraid to say. We used the first letters when we had to." She stopped. "When we had to make locks we could carry without writing them down." I looked at her. "Did you?" I started, then restarted. "Before me? Did you have different names?" "Yes," Dad said. So quickly the yes knocked into my expectations and spilled them. I had the absurd thought that I would be furious if they had been spies. Spies are such an obvious secret. "What were you?" I asked because who felt like a bigger room than I could enter without better shoes. "Archivists," Mom said, and something in her face sat down like a person who has been standing for years. The story did not come out all at once. It arrived in a flock, in pieces, wheeling and landing, small wings beating. They had been part of a group, a loose net, an orchard of weird trees called Orchard, whose whole deal was to keep things from being erased. Photographs, yes. Audio, sometimes. Lists of names and dates when names and dates kept being misplaced by people whose jobs were to keep track of them. It had started as a group for artists who were tired of painting the same pretty arithmetic and had noticed their country's subtraction problems. People, history, receipts. They made backups when backups were still exotic. They wrote down things that were supposed to pass like a rumor and stay that way. "In another life," Mom said, "I was the person at a party who would ask, 'Who is taking a picture but not a picture for Instagram? Who is writing down the name of the woman who spoke, not the man who walked over her sentence?'" Dad wasn't a spy. He was the worst kind of dangerous. A sysadmin with a conscience and too many friends. He knew where to put boxes so air could get to them. He knew which cables weren't cables but lifelines. He knew how to listen to machines the way other people listen to bodies. He had been the person you call when the thing that cannot fail does the thing it cannot. We were very unromantic, he said, and then amended. Except for the parts that were obviously too much. Why did it stop? I asked because I had reached the place where questions don't end. It didn't, Mom said. We did. Because of you. She reached her hand across the table, and I took it without pretending it was a peace treaty. Because there is a room in the world where a baby is sleeping, and all the metaphors sit down and shut up. And the archive? I asked. Dad shook his head. We gave what we could to people who needed it. Some of it we kept because it was dangerous to give and dangerous to keep. And some of it, he smiled, but it was not a smile for us. Some of it was for us. Can I see? I asked, not because I deserve to, but because wanting is the only first step I am any good at. Not tonight, Mom said. The rule was, if we told the story, we'd tell it when we weren't doing dishes. Tomorrow. Tonight, you go put on a show for your father about how college applications aren't terrifying, and we'll try to pretend your room doesn't look like a sorority closet after an earthquake. I went to bed and did not sleep like a person in a story who has just learned he was born under a different star. I slept like a teenager with too many tabs open. At 2 in the morning, a car honked and I hated every machine in our neighborhood. At 4, my phone buzzed with a text from Eva that said, I metaphored again, sorry, and a picture of the train station's busted clock overlaid with a quote from James Baldwin, The 6 Birds. I woke to the smell of coffee so good it could have passed as forgiveness. They showed me in the daylight. We took the laptop to the table like it was a 4th place. Dad typed a long password for the archive without letting me see. Family rules do not collapse just because you grow a secret. Then looked at Mom for the nod as if in our little republic she is the one who certifies votes. The zip unfurled like a banner. Inside were photos. Yes, but also things my mother called living maps. Scans of notebooks full of snaked lines and circles that were always someone's house, someone's shop, someone's memory with a corner torn, with notes like, she sells bread on Tuesdays, also remembers the name of the officer with the scar. There were audio files that were nothing but noise until you realized the noise was a city's breath. Then under it someone whispered a list. There were PGP keys with names that only had the patience to be first names. There were PDF printouts of emails that I am probably not allowed to exist as a person who likes sleeping. There were small pictures of big things and big pictures of small things. A woman's hand holding a key, a man's eye with a rim of red where the goggles weren't. Who were you? I asked again because my mother's face in all of these was both exactly her face and a face that had never met me. Lark, she said. Because I woke up too early. Your father was Finch because he pretended not to sing. We had an orchard with swallows and a magpie and a dove who hated his name but loved the joke. We tagged our work when it needed to be tagged, Dad said. Because when they erode the names, someone has to write them back in. He showed me the part of EXIF I never bother with, user comment, maker notes, and I saw the tiny letters that make up a system I understood in the way you understand a code because it is a code, initial, time, place, hash. A rigged picture of someone's life is a lie. A picture with a receipt is a story you can stick to in a room that demands nouns. The problem with learning your parents had a life before you isn't that it makes your life smaller. It's that it makes theirs bigger, and you are suddenly very small inside a room you thought was perfectly your size. I asked bad questions. Were you in danger? Are you still? Is anyone looking for this? Does the state care? Which state? I asked the kind of questions a sophomore writes for English class when they are trying to be profound. My parents answered the way people who don't owe you a good story answer. Carefully, gently, on the record. We had rules, Mom said. We had a house inside the work. We held to it because we wanted to live to have the argument about whether our child would be named after a poet or a tree. You picked a tree, I said. I picked an archaeologist, Dad said. But you wouldn't answer to Indiana. The investigation part did not begin with a chase. It began with a sticker. On the underside of the archive folder was a text file called orchard_public. TXT that contained a single link to a site I had never seen, and I have seen all the sites because the internet is my neighborhood. It was a link to a library, not the kind with books, the kind with ghosts, the Wayback Machine, a snapshot of a page from 2002 with typography that shares ancestry with Microsoft Word art, and a background the color of a bad decision. The pages belonged to a collective with a different name. The logo was a lemon. The posts were a fugue, dates, lists, the occasional manifesto about the dignity of receipts. I clicked a post, and a picture loaded with the slowness of a past century. A man's shoe in the corner of a frame. A wall. A chalked number. 416. In the corner, stamped small and serious. Orchard/LF/2001-04-16. L&F. Lark and Finch. It wasn't that I didn't believe them. It was that belief took a second to fit into the place in my body where I had always kept parents. I could have stopped there, and a better person would have. But curiosity is the only muscle I have ever liked exercising. I wanted to know who else. I wanted to know the shape of the room my family had sat in for a decade before I entered it. I messaged Eva because she has the kind of wisdom teachers used to write letters about. My parents are part of an underground lemon. I wrote, and then deleted it, then wrote, I found something. Can I tell you a story that isn't mine to tell but is, kind of? She sent a voice note. Yes, but gently. Also, if this ends with you confessing to a crime, I'm hanging up. I told her. She made the correct noises, the ones that say, I believe you, and also, I would prefer your parents not go to jail. Then she said, let's ask my aunt. Her aunt, Dr. Salazar, heads the oral history project at the university. She collects stories of people who assumed their stories were already compost. We went to her office on Wednesday after school. She listened. She didn't interrupt. She made a tiny sound at section, user comment, that made me think she knows metadata like I know the way to my bus stop. When I finished, she asked, what do your parents want? It's complicated, I said, even though it wasn't. They want to be left alone. They want the story to live. They want the right people to have the right thing. They want... I looked at Eva. They want to choose their own verbs. Dr. Salazar nodded. Bring me what they think is safe, she said. Not everything. Not anything with names that are promises. We have a process. We can keep what needs to be quiet for a time and noisy when noise is useful. We also have a grant for digitization that your father is going to disrespect by doing a better job than the fancy company we hired. Dad said no, then yes, then no, then yes again. He and Mom argued in the kind of way that is only beautiful if you are not the child of the people arguing. The argument was not about whether, it was about how. We made a list like the old lists in their notebooks, but cleaner. What can go? What must stay? Who needs to be asked? Who cannot be asked for reasons that sound like impractical poetry? Disappeared, sleeping, in danger. We wrote orchard plus lemon equals library at the top because naming things is the only power I inherited that didn't break when I tried to use it. I live in a small city by a big river with a train station whose clock stopped pretending right around the time. Selfies taught us to trust cameras in a new way. There are people here who disappear and reappear, people with histories that have been told to behave. Once you notice that, it is hard to unnotice. In the week after my parents told me, I saw old men who had been young in the 90s and realized they are full of data. I watched my gym teacher's hands while he tied the net and knew by the way his palms had learned friction that there were parts of him not in the syllabus. I went to the grocery store with Mom and counted for people she greeted by names I have never heard her use for anyone else. The investigation took me down rabbit holes that smelled like Film Fixer and Late Night Code. I learned that my parents had a person named Halim who was the orchard's memory of a specific border, and a person named May who described herself as a note-taker with opinions, and who once apparently hid 3 negatives in a loaf of bread. This was before my time. Later, everything is plastic and phones. I listened to an audio file of an old protest, the chant in a language I do not speak, with Mom's voice under it counting and counting, because when the men who count say there were 3, sometimes the mountains remember there were 500. I didn't tell everyone. I told Eva. I told my debate coach, Mr. Nguyen, who believes in every side of every coin a little too much, that I might have to miss one tournament to help my family with a thing. He said, family is the only tournament with a prize that matters, which is the kind of sentence he saves for days when someone looks like they need it. I told Ms. Rains, The history teacher, a version of the story that involved the word archives, and watched her eyes do the math. Entrance essay. There was one message, one night, that made me want to shut the laptop and put it out the window. It arrived on an old email my father hadn't used since Hestia was an idea we could only afford if we stopped paying for pre-ground coffee. It said, "If you are reading this, you opened the orchard." It was signed with a name Mom recognized and made a sound to learn was alive. There was no threat. There was a line. "We still have 3. You still have 2. The lemon keeps." Dad read it. He nodded once. "We used to ping each other," he said, "to see who was still at their post." Mom wrote back. She wrote 2 lines and a story. She said, "We have a teenager with questions. If the lemon keeps, perhaps the lemon can hold." The lemon wrote back, "Bring tea." We brought tea. The woman who opened the door to the apartment on the east side wore her hair in a kerchief like my grandmother and a sweatshirt with a cracked cartoon lemon. She wasn't old, but she had that old person's grace I envy. The ability to let silence live. "Lark," she said, and my mother folded into her. The kind of fold you do when you've been holding your own spine up longer than a reasonable person should have to. They talked. Halim came by and sat on the arm of the couch like a man who took many arms of many couches seriously. The lemon woman, Marisol, which made me mad at my parents for not naming me something with that much salt, asked me what I wanted. "I want to understand my family," I said, trying not to be dramatic about it. "No," she said. "You want to know whether the person you are has been pre-decided by these people who almost got themselves killed for a few photographs and a timeline." "I mean," I said, and then laughed at myself, which is my other talent. "Let me show you something," she said, and pulled out a box of prints the size of small windows. They were not art. My mother's are art. These were evidence. Here is a doorway. Here is a bruise. Here is a poster half-torn that still says enough. Here is a smile on a day when smiling was proof of something other than joy. Here is the warehouse door from the first photo I saw, the one with the chalk number. On the back of each, a stamp, orchard/lemon/date/initials, and a space for notes, which alternated between the poetic, "She had a green ribbon in her hair and bravery in a shirt pocket," and the literal, 2 officers, one left-handed, one with limp, walked toward Eastgate, 1213. You don't understand the word receipt until you see a picture next to a man who is saying a different picture. My parents and their lemon friends had made receipts in a time and place that wanted to pay with rumors. I have known all my life what a rumor can do to you if you let it be the final draft. Kids, and I am still a kid, however much this sounds like I'm trying to be an NPR segment, don't get to decide what we inherit. We get to decide the work we do with it. I didn't choose to be the child of people who considered the possibility that someone might knock on a door at night if the wrong picture met the wrong person. I do get to choose whether I type something carelessly that will ruin a family who couldn't afford careful. Dr. Salazar took a first batch. We stood over the scanner like surgeons and baptized the images in pixels. Dad insisted on proper naming conventions. Mom insisted on notes. I insisted on making a spreadsheet that would make any librarian cry happy tears. We adopted a version of the Lark rule of passphrase that did not rely on your relationship to the truth but did rely on your ability to remember which things in the world you loved before you were tired. There was a day when we almost stopped. A woman we had to call A. Because her name is a vial we promised not to open showed up at our door with a face so guarded you'd have forgiven her for refusing to live inside it. She sat at our table and drank the coffee you drink when you taste for poison even as you know this is not the house that would do you in. And she told us about a night when my parents had not been my parents yet and something needed to be moved from one place to another with a note that said the word witness. And my mother cried in that clean way she has, and my father looked at the table and saw a date only he remembered, and I learned that bravery is always uglier up close. I told Eva I wanted to write about it for the school paper. She said, "Write around it. Write about the digital trail we leave and the boxes we forget to lock. Write about how your mother doesn't take pictures of faces anymore, just hands and the backs of knees. Write about school servers and naming conventions and why we don't label files surprise party. Because surprises are not the only thing that can be ruined by curiosity." So I wrote a piece called On Not Erasing, and I turned in 3 drafts that tried too hard and a 4th that didn't try at all. Our media advisor said, "This is mature," and then amended to, "for a person with your hair." The comments online were a predictable mix of, "Why are you so serious?" and "This is why nobody likes Gen Z," and a surprising number of, "My aunt was that person who kept the Polaroids. We had to tell my grandmother." It felt like the step you end all fairy tales with, "Tell an elder or the magic loses its color." We brought her a box of photographs of her daughter being young and unreasonably brave. She asked if any of them were the sort you could put on a shelf. "The rest you put in a safe and ignore unless your town forgets itself," she said. "Then you open the safe and you bring out the ones you think the town will hate the least." Some days the investigation was silly. We went to the train station to rephotograph a wall that had been painted over 5 times and yet still remembered the first word written on it. I watched my father measure the frame for a perfect 50 millimeters equivalent like a person who still believes in math. Eva made me stand where Mom had once stood and look at the sky that had stubbornly refused to change. I found bees. I found them everywhere, on the Lemon Woman's grocery list, on the sticker on a notebook. Later, Mom told me the bees were part of the orchard code because bees do the work of carrying futures around. Some days it was a fight. Dad wanted to redact too much. Mom wanted to keep the parts that were messy because, what's the point of the truth if you give it a bath and a blowout before bringing it to school? Dr. Salazar wanted footnotes, and I wanted a future where object permanence applied to justice. We met in the middle where all good disappointments happen. Our town has a winter fair with lights and waffles and a man who plays the violin as if his neighbors aren't 2 feet away. The library set up a small exhibit, Echoes, Receipts of a City, with a few prints from the orchard, the kind with the danger combed out of their hair, and placards with words like evidence, memory, we, and enough. People came. They read. The old men who had been the men in the photos didn't come because they don't need to read themselves. But their daughters and sons did. And my parents stood at the back and didn't cry. I cried enough for all of us. It ends like this, but it doesn't end. I am 17. I can't legally sign the forms that would give away the things I want to. College is a door I'm going to walk through, partly because Dr. Salazar wrote a letter and partly because my father taught me how to keep a server alive in a dust storm. Mom has started teaching a workshop called Everyone is a Historian, Especially You, where she hands out cheap point-and-shoot cameras and asks people to take pictures of the places in our town that tell the truth even when we don't invite them to. The archive isn't all unlocked. Some of it is a password only a funeral can break. Some of it is a lemon we will store until it softens. We added a file, my idea. Dad coded. Mom wrote the note, called read_if_txt. It explains the orchard to a person who never knew the orchard existed. It uses as few verbs as possible because verbs are reckless. It starts with the line, "We weren't heroes. We were your parents. We also kept receipts." I sit sometimes at my mother's darkroom table and watch the pictures come up in the tray and realize that chemistry is just memory with patience. You soak a paper in mute things, and then something else comes to visit, and the image becomes again the thing it always wanted to be. I hold a photo with tongs and think of metadata hiding like second names. I think of the orchard, of the lemon, of bees. I think of the way my father's hand looked the first time he showed me how to name a file in a way that will make sense to a stranger. My last act before sleep is to pick up my phone and not open any apps for a whole minute. I set it down. I listen to our apartment breathe. Somewhere in the archive, a folder is named after a fruit. Inside it is a picture of a wall that no longer exists with a word chalked in crooked letters. Enough. The date is wrong. The coordinates are exact. The names are absent on purpose. In the comment field there is a rule. 3 words, 1 truth, 1 lie, and the thing you're finally brave enough to say. I don't know which word is mine yet. I do know this. When someone tries to subtract me, I plan to have the receipt.